Until 100 years ago, the limestone hill country of central Texas was a forbidding corner of the great American Southwest. A land where the frontier was yesterday. Birthplace of the 36th President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln once spoke of a memory of home that served as an anchor and guide, that shaped his days and every judgment he made, distant in time and place, but lingering nearby. The birthplace of Lyndon Johnson is a land that is sparsely settled, the land whose history and texture haunt the memory of those who have left it and those who remain. The hill country home where the president comes to remember is in the center of Texas, 1,800 miles from Washington, a microsecond from the White House. This land gave witness to the stagecoach and cattle drives, remembers the tents and campfires of the Comanches, a land that saw the marching Spanish columns of Coronado. It remembers the wagon trains of German immigrants working their way up the river valley from the Gulf of Mexico. The young men from the South, following the river toward a new life in the land of the West. When the president's family settled along the banks of the Pedernales River, the time was the 1840s. Then the land of the LBJ Ranch was part of a wide public domain, free to any homesteader who would stake his claim and put up his shelter. Among the hackberry trees and live oaks, the journey of the president's forefathers came to an end. They had traveled a long, slow way by wagon and ox team, and they meant to stay. Today, on a visit, the president can view his pastures and inspect his herd, prize-winning stock whose sleek well-being is in sharp contrast to an earlier time, a harsher time along the river. A generation ago, the Texan watched his cattle feed on a land burned by drought and withered by hot winds. the day his family came to this place, cattle held their life, their hopes, and their aspirations. In the shadow of the ranch house, the memories and symbols of an earlier Texas become alive. Herein, the humble beginnings of a great Texas family are still preserved in walls of hand-cut limestone. The shade of 3 generations falls on the windows from the same sheltering trees. It is still a land where their forefathers would find much to recognize, where some of the live oaks have stood against the wind since the time of Columbus, where the roots now reach deep beneath the river. These were the first of his kin to rest in Texas. Generations before, his forefathers were buried in Alabama and Kentucky. For their women and oxen, life was short. Neither expected much, and they sometimes died young. On the family land and throughout the hill country, there are the reminders of the people who passed before, of those who made it and those who didn't. But the people learned to build with what they found. The president's grandfather built his barn and outbuildings to protect his crops and his family, as fortresses against Indians and against the wind which changed direction, but always blew. Here in a vast loneliness, a man learned to live by his own hands and with his own thoughts, and to contemplate without fear a future that nature often said did not belong to him. There were cattle in Texas that 100 years ago discovered the secret of how to live here and helped teach the secret. It was said of Texas cattle that they could feed on the limestone and take their water from the dew. And in these herds, the Texan found his future. The president's grandfather bred the Texas Longhorn and drove him by the thousands up the trails. They drove their fortunes across half a continent. For some, this journey was their last, but most found their way back to the hill country of Texas to begin again. On August 27, 1908, his grandfather announced the news to the countryside. A U.S. senator is born, he said. And it was in the tradition of his parents and his grandparents that it be so. The times were hard, but in his eyes, it did not seem like poverty. The hard times were changing slowly, but in the cedar thickets along the ridges, there remained a richness of experience for a young boy growing up. The cycle of life displayed itself in dramatic ways. After each warm rain of April and September, the hill country freshens with a new springtime. Below in the ranchers' valleys, as the rain lifts, the land brings forth his hopes for a good year. Now the water runs for the post oak and pecan, peach and plum. Down the dry creek beds to fill the small ponds, the grateful streams run full to the banks. For a moment, the land comes alive with color. Water leaves as it comes. For a few days along the creek beds, the pools remain. In the hot sun, they will shrink again and ask, how long before the next time? Among the rocks and hills of a president's country, the land is locked in a battle from season to season and year to year. And the shapes of the struggle remain. There is a Texas song that sings of a dry wind that can blow out fortunes as a woman blows out a lamp. When family and flocks leave the land for a while to wait for a better season. Johnson City had been settled long before by the president's grandfather, and here from the land they moved. In a modest two-bedroom house, they began a new life. A life that the land beyond the town could not alone support. Across this humble threshold would come new voices and new ideas. On its porch would sit men who had traveled all of Texas and beyond. Though the house was simple, it was warm. It contained the simple symbols of a culture which had shared the frontier with this family for 100 years. For a future president, the world beyond was Austin, the capital of Texas, where the people of the district had sent his father to protect their rights and to bring a better life to the people of the hill country. The elders said, The future, perhaps, will not belong to us, but it must belong to our children. Their schooling was simple, but it was free. And at home, there were other lessons taught. It was a village of many faiths, Lutheran and Catholic, Baptist and Methodist. He joined hands with the membership of the Disciples of Christ, an American church that had followed the frontier for 100 years. But if religion provided a path, politics was their passion. Men could travel to the state capital and bring back first-hand news. The world's newspapers came here, and most of its ideas. Cattle and the neighboring land were still their chief concern, but these involved them with the rest of the country and the world. In Johnson City, a future president could eavesdrop on men whose hands had touched a stirring Texas past. In the places where they gathered, a young boy could hear the talk of men whose memories spanned the history of the West, of fathers who had ridden with the pioneers, of the droughts, when the locust brought night to the sun and the dust brought darkness to the moon. A young boy growing up in Johnson City could look upon the faces of people who were the faces of the land itself. Faces from the old rock. There were long years upon them, but no fear. Texas history had been a long, hard way. A 100 years ago, the president's forebears had gone out to fight with Sam Houston at San Jacinto, signed the Texas Declaration of Independence, served in the first Congress of the Texas Republic. They fought and lived for a Texas wilderness connected only by common principles. His father and his grandfather, too, had traveled these roads. His grandfather to serve as Secretary of State and later in the Texas House. A generation later, his father served 6 terms in the Texas legislature and was famous for counseling tolerance and justice from the State House floor. Traveling with his father, Lyndon Johnson saw the road ahead, and it was long and lonely. But even in the hill country of Texas, a road led to somewhere. In 1932, it was time for him to take his own journey down a longer road. He had, since graduating from high school, worked as a farmhand, as a common laborer. He'd worked his way through college. He'd taught school to Mexican Americans. He would not forget what he had left behind. His grandfather could look with pride on the harnessing of the wind. But Lyndon Johnson, as a young congressman, worked in Washington to bring water to the hill country when the wind might die, when no rain fell. Water could now irrigate the crops, turn the dynamos and the pumps, nourish the stock. In this arid land, streams became rivers, and rivers became lakes. And in a country where water is life itself, a new life began. farms where he had seen women carry water from the well, where men and women grew too old too soon with the burden of physical labor, there was now another kind of power. But if the future looked brighter, the road beneath was still rough. To level the barrier of distances, which for generations had kept men from markets and markets from men, there began to appear in this new day new roads. Not all roads through the hill country are without dust. Nor will there be an end to the problems of this land or the nation of which it is a part. But 3 generations looked out upon this land that often clouded their aspirations and darkened their hopes. But a free land where each generation could see and seek further than the one before. From this corner of America, a young man set out 30 years back, bearing an idea planted by his forebears. Today, from the same place, he can look out now on the harvest. It can take a man or a boy a long time to travel from Johnson City, Texas to Washington, D.C. But when he makes his move, he carries with him the heritage that has shaped his spirit and will govern his judgments to the end of his days.